record now.
Yeah, I was going to say, Carla, I think maybe we first met at Rally On.
Oh, yeah.
Like in DC, maybe? Do they have one in DC? It's been a long time of overlapping events and circles and people, which is what makes our Agile world so great. So I want to give you guys some background on this topic and kind of what brought me to this content that we're going to go through. I gave a talk a couple of years ago at Lean Agile US on Kanban retrospectives and how to use all of the data from your Kanban metrics to help you improve your Kanban system and what that looks like from a retro perspective. And you'll see some of that terminology as we dig into this tonight. But I think what's interesting is working through that presentation a few times and through using that in coaching and consulting Kanban teams, I realized that there's kind of a greater practice here that ties together the action items we create with the data that we review. And so that's what we're going to go through tonight. Let's see here. A little bit about me. I'm the CEO and founder of ScatterSpoke, which is a space for more effective retrospectives. My husband and I started this company together in 2015. It's been quite the journey being in the software side of things after being in the Agile world and IT world for so long. We got funding in 2019 and were able to go fully focus on ScatterSpoke as our full-time jobs. And it's been like pretty comical how hard it is to do all of the things that we tell other people to do when it's our own tool. So things like small batch sizes and small releases and all this stuff the types of things I would coach other teams to are really tricky when it's your own baby. Carl mentioned prokanban.org. I joined as the CEO of ProKanban in October, and we are trying to build an inclusive Kanban learning community that's really for the community. If you have any questions about that, I'm happy to talk through that at the end. I'm based in Denver. I've been really active in the Denver Agile community and the Mile High Agile Conferences. I was a board member for the Agile Uprising for 4 years. And my most important job is mama to these three, who are now 3, 11, and 13. This picture feels so old already. Maybe that's just COVID years. They're like dog years, I think. Everything seems longer. So let's talk about retros. I'll talk briefly here about what retros are, but I think, everybody's probably pretty familiar with retrospectives. These are an opportunity for the team to come together and provide feedback about how they're working. And this can be positive feedback or negative feedback around products, process, performance, how they're communicating. But we're using all of this as a basis for improvement. And when we get into why we're retroing, right, it can be looking at how things are working. But it can also be a lot about how the team is working together. So looking at how we communicate, how we hand work back and forth. It's also about building a strong channel of communication within our team. I think, when I'm working with new teams, things tend to be very quiet sometimes in retros, where it takes a while for the teams to get talking and get to know each other and get comfortable, sometimes providing what can be hard feedback to share, sometimes negative feedback. So it takes some time to build up that trust and safety. I think one of the most important things that can come out of retros are that the team starts to establish ownership of their process and practices. So through these little refinements that we make, the process really becomes the teams to tinker with and the teams to own instead of something that's kind of done to the team or on their behalf. So over time, the retros really help each team establish that ownership. And then the last thing is that this helps us modify the process over time to help it fit the needs of the team. As teams change in size and in skills and in the code, the code that they're working in or the part of the business that they're working in, it's important that we keep coming back to that to say, does the way that we were working still fit the way that we need to be working? So this is a kind of a continuous growth and way that we find the right fit for our team. You may have heard of this referred to as Kaizen or a Kaizen mindset, and that is this act of making bad, like the bad points better. And really what we want to think about here, and probably the translation we hear all the time in the Agile or Lean community, is change for the better. But how do we keep looking at what we're doing with our retrospective process as a process of learning and improving, and not just doing the retros for the sake of, checking the box that we do them. So I want to pause here and think about, when we do our retros, what we often look at, right? So the type of retros that we have. If everybody's familiar with the Zoom reactions, you guys can raise the little cartoon hand through your Zoom reactions, or you can just raise them on your camera if you've got your camera on. But I'm curious, when you get in your retros, how many of you start your retro by reviewing your action items? Let's see, not too many, some. See, 4, I think. So when we think about these action items, I want to walk through some examples here. So these are some of the things that I actually took from past retros. So let's set up a meeting to discuss the branch process, clean up user stories as stuff changes mid-sprint, define more clear acceptance criteria in JIRA, dedicate time for developers to study topics and new tech related to their work, review sprint burn-up chart as part of daily stand-up, stop rotating the Scrum Master role. That one's funny to me. More liberal permission to view infrastructure settings so we can resolve issues faster, and include QA folks in sprint planning. Do these feel familiar to the types of things that come out of your retros? See some nodding. Does anything seem busted about these? Any thoughts? What seems broken?
They're all a bit fuzzy.
To me, none of them asks about the people. It's all process, which is something that I personally entirely dislike, but I have to align with the rest of the people. Can't work on my own.
Yeah, those are great observations. I think the other thing that stands out to me when I look at these is that they're very binary. So what happens when we go to pull these into the next retro is it's really just, did I do this or did I not do this? So did I set up a meeting to discuss the branch process? Sure, yeah, I set up a meeting, but did that do anything? Did that actually help us with our branch merge process? Are we cleaning up user stories as stuff changes mid-sprint? Yes or no, but why? What do we hope to change by that behavior? A lot of these are really just checking the box, and that tends to be how we set up our action items. We come up with what thing needs to change and we assign it to somebody, and we make sure that we put that change into place. What's missing from this is that it's not telling us that something actually improved. It's telling us that something got done. So how do we start to look at our retrospective action items in a slightly different way so that we can come up with action items where we can measure the improvement and tell that it's giving us the desired effect? You guys probably know the answer, but I think it's data. So when we think about how we do this, I think it starts with how we set up our retros. So we want to look at 2 things. We want to look at the baseline data as part of our retrospective, so we can say, where are we starting right now? And then what's broken? What change do we want to implement? And then how do we expect that to be reflected in the data that we're reviewing? So we want to start to make these targeted small improvements and then come up with action items that help us really tell if it's improving or not. From a lean perspective, you've probably seen something very, very similar to this in a plan, do, check, act. So planning your improvements, putting them into place, measuring your success against your baseline, and then adjusting or tweaking. We're going to use something very similar to this that I call the Retro Hypothesis Canvas. It's really just kind of a retro-specific riff on plan, do, check, act. So what we want to think of here is, for our action items, what impact do we expect this change to have? Why are we making this change? And that's going to help us understand the cause. the cause for the change. How will we measure it? So how will we know that it's working? What's the measure to help us tell if this improvement is really moving the needle up or down? When will we check back in? So I think, depending on the scope of your retros, let's say we're all doing them 2 weeks. Do we expect to see a difference in the data in 2 weeks? Or is this going to take us a month? And if it's a month or 2 months, what is that date when we expect to see that number change or move up or down? And then think of the plan, do, check, act circle. Your act is what happens if our hypothesis is true, or what happens if it's false? So what if this change drives this number up or drives this number down? So from a Kanban perspective, one of the things I see teams tinker with the most is their WIP limits. Not always for the best, but I tend to give them a lot of autonomy in moving their WIP limits around, especially as it for a newer Kanban team. And I do this because I think it helps them gain a greater control and greater understanding of the impact of increasing or decreasing their work in progress. But I always try to get them to phrase that change built around this retrospective canvas. So how do we, what increase, if the team says we want to increase our WIP, we want to pull more work in, my question would be why? So what impact do we think that will have on our system or on our delivery? How will we measure it? When will we check back in? So is this a 2-week change and we'll move it up or down? Or is this like maybe a month, we'll leave it higher and then make a decision? And what happens if our hypothesis is true? So if we think raising our WIP will help us get more work done, if it's true, do we keep it? Or if it's not, if it's false, do we lower it back to what it was at before? So let's take a look. And full disclosure, this is totally made up. There is no official retrospective canvas here, but this is just, like I said, leaning heavily on that plan, do, check, act. So what's the need? What's the driver for the change? What is the change that we're going to make? And how will we test it? So this is your hypothesis here. What is the change to our behavior or our process or our people? How will we check that the change is working? And then correct, how will we make adjustments as so we can get closer to what our desired result looks like? So we're going to go through some examples tonight of a few different, looking at some data around based on what this is telling us and what issues we may identify or fixes we might want to test as a team. How would we apply this thinking to those, making those into great action items? So we're going to go through 6 different data points here. Again, these are my names for these things. So we're going to look at the big 3, which is going to be cycle time, WIP, and throughput. We're going to talk about piles of work. We're going to talk about outliers, blockers, unplanned work. And I couldn't see the name of who said people were missing, but we'll talk about feelings because people are at the core of all of the work that we do, regardless of how much data or process you have. So I want to make sure that we talk through how to make sure there's space and safety for people to express how things are going. So let's start with the big 3. This is going to be cycle time, throughput, and your actual work in progress. These numbers work great for Scrum teams or Kanban teams. And what I think is awesome about looking at these metrics for Scrum teams is that for a lot of teams, they tend to pull everything into in progress at the beginning of a sprint. And then that might compromise their ability to get all of that work over the finish line by the end of the sprint. And so what can be nice about looking at WIP for Scrum teams is that it encourages starting something, getting it done before starting the next thing, which is a blessing for anyone who's on the QA side of the house, right? To not feel like they have to test everything at the 11th hour of their sprint, but also helps make sure that you're getting the highest priority work completed. So that, if you have 80% of your, if you have 10 stories and all of them are 80% done, or a better scenario would be of those 10 stories, we have 8 done. Maybe we have 2 we didn't get to. So when we look at these metrics, there's a couple things we're trying to determine. How long does it take us to complete work? So that's our cycle time. Our throughput is just a count of how much work did we get done in a given period of time. And if you're doing these in 2-week blocks, it would be like, how many user stories did we complete in 2 weeks? And then your actual WIP would just be how much work in progress did we have? And so we're looking at these three numbers together. I'm going to show you, I tried to be tool agnostic here. So you're going to see screenshots from a lot of different tools, but we're going to start with Actionable Agile. This is showing us a view here of cycle time, WIP, and throughput. So I can see here, 85% of my work was done in 16 days or less. I had 35 items in progress, and my current throughput rate is 2.24 items per day. That matches up roughly with what it was last week and last month. So pretty consistent throughput rate here. So as a team, these are great data points to kick off a retro. There's a couple things that it's going to tell us. It's helping us determine, are we delivering fast enough? So a lot of teams will have a target cycle time or a service level expectation in mind that they're trying to deliver against. Even within a sprint, this number becomes important because you have a time box that you're trying to deliver within. So looking at, are we delivering on pace for what we thought we would be doing as a team? Will we meet our deadlines? So you can start to use cycle time and throughput to help you forecast if you're going to hit a fixed delivery date. Are we working on too much or too little? And that's where our work in progress number comes into play. And is our work in progress consistent? So these tee up a slightly different conversation, right? We tend to start our retros with like, what's working well, what's not working well, what needs to change, or mad, sad, glad, some variation of that. This starts our retro then with some data that's really rooted in how we're working. And from this data, there's a few things we could consider. We could agree to follow the WIP limits. So I've had teams that have said, you know, we want to have 10 tickets per person, and my soul dies a little bit, but I usually let them try it so they can feel how that works and how that, you know, what that does for their throughput and cycle time. So they could agree that they're going to follow WIP. Maybe they decide they want to increase or decrease WIP. They might decide to make a change to their workflow policies. So changing when things move in or out of their system. They might decide to create an expedited lane. Don't tell Dan, Carl. But they might decide to change some policies or create some different ways of working based on the data that they're seeing. So let's try this. We're going to try this with our canvas here. So if we had to address cycle time, WIP, and throughput, and we said, we have a change. Let's identify what our need might be. So if our need was that our work in progress was too high, what could be the fix to test? So maybe in this case, we say we want to lower the WIP, and we're going to start with lowering the work in progress limit on our to-do column. That might be an interesting fix to test, right? We feel like if we meter the flow of work coming into the system, that it will help us pull less work in. And so our measure, the fix could be that if we lower our work in progress limit on the to-do column to 4 items, that we think our overall system WIP will stay under 12. And so that could be the measure. And so we might try that for 2 weeks and see how that's working. So we'll check back in at the next retro and then see if we need to change that up or down based on the results that we're seeing. So that's one example of how you could run through this process with something from your cycle time, WIP, and throughput. All right, let's talk about the next one here, piles. So when you think about piles, and I used to have a great image. I couldn't find it from a Kanban class I had taught that was like piles of leaves, piles of laundry, and a pile of hot dogs. And it said nobody likes piles, unless they're piles of cash, I guess. But when we think about piles here, we're thinking about piles of work. And what often happens in the way that we work is one part of our team might work way faster. We might have more people contributing to that part or that step of our workflow than another part of our team or our workflow. And I started my career as a QA engineer, so I can definitely attest to this. I would spend, about 9 months of the year playing ping pong and waiting for something to do. And then the other 3 months of the year, like stressing out and testing until the wee hours of the morning, trying to get stuff out the door to production. And that's what we mean when we think about piles, is where is work piling up that someone's going to have to jump in and try to clear out. So you basically have to work extra to keep pace with the pile that's been created. When we think about piles, think of your cumulative flow diagram. We're going to look at one here in a minute, but even, JIRA has these. You can look at these for Scrum teams or Kanban teams. But what we want to try to identify is there work piling up in one area of the workflow? And this is visualized nice through the cumulative flow diagram, because you see the bands of color get bigger. You see that pile of work growing. And what's interesting about this is you can have a consistent work in progress limit. So you could see that your work in progress is staying consistent over time, but one part of the system may be overburdened where you see that pile growing. This is, I think, a very important chart to look at for the people side of things, right? So teammates can be stressed or overburdened or idle or unable to pull new work. But often what happens is that's like a growing pile of things that is going to stress somebody on your team out. Often it can be QA or anybody who's kind of at the end of that line was the snowball. The snowball is growing and ready to roll downhill on them. So let's take a look at this. So here's an example. This one's from Kanban of a team's board, and you can see here where the colors change in this cumulative flow diagram. It's telling us how much work is sitting in these different phases. And so one of the things that stands out to me the most, you can see this is a pretty old screenshot, is this orange band right below the horizontal line that says waiting on link. So what's happening there where all of a sudden it looks like in September, all of that work clears out and you see that orange band get skinnier and go up to the right. So that was a pile of work that looks like it got cleared out all at the same time. So to me, that's an obvious opportunity for improvement. What's happening there and who helped clear that? Was it a big batch of something that we were all waiting on? That looks like an opportunity for improvement for this team. I see that same pattern with that big red band getting bigger and then disappearing again in October on this chart. So it's like the middle of October, waiting increased and then cleared out again. So again, work piled up and then work left the system. So those two spots kind of indicate the same pattern to me that would be a good conversation for this retro. So in the retro, we could say, where is most of the work in our system? Do we need more capacity? Like maybe that waiting on link piece is waiting for another team. Do we need to throttle a different part of our workflow so that work doesn't pile up in that phase, maybe the phase before it? Or should we add or remove workflow policies? Maybe work is getting to that point, the add link column, but it's not actually ready for that step. So it's getting stuck there. Maybe we need better workflow policies to make sure work isn't getting stuck there. And so what are some changes you could make based on this? We could increase or decrease the state WIP limits or the stage WIP limits for each column. You could hire more people to add capacity. And I know this one probably sounds kind of funny or tongue-in-cheek, but for a lot of teams, when you start looking at this kind of data, it can point to a gap in either skills, or which is the next one here, gap in specializations, or a gap in the team or in the resources that you have available. And that's where being able to have a conversation around how do we adjust the way we're working to accommodate that becomes really, really important to the people on the team doing the work. And then the last one here is, how do you visualize aging work? So how do we make sure that we can really show on the board where work is getting stuck so that we don't continue to add to that growing pile or have some policies around reducing that pile? So let's think about the same pattern: cause, change, check, correct, for our piles conversation. So I'm going to backtrack here so we can come over here and look at the chart as we talk about this. So our cause in this one is that it looks like we have a problem where work piles up in the red in the waiting on link and then clears out. And it looks like every other month from the looks of this chart that pattern's happening. So what would be our test? So we could say we want to focus on reducing that big pile of work that grows there and then having to work extra to clear it out. So in order to do that, we think the root cause of this is that things are entering into that phase after peer review that aren't actually ready for the waiting on link step, whatever that is. And so our test could be that we're going to add more workflow policies to the peer review column to make sure that all of the information to add the link is done at that peer review phase before it gets to waiting on link, and see if that helps. So that's one thing you could do that you could test out here and try. And then the test could be, are we able to keep our waiting on link under its WIP limit, right? So we're going to connect the need, the change, and the intended result. So the change isn't just reducing the work that's in waiting on link. It's how do we adjust our system and our process to make sure that we're finding a more consistent flow of work through that phase. Any questions on that one? All right, let's go to outliers. So outliers is always a fun conversation. And I think one thing that's really important when we talk about outliers in retrospectives is that this doesn't become an opportunity to single someone on the team out. I think that I see that more often than not. And what happens is we pull up our scatter plot, and we'll look at one here in a moment. And we pick one card off of the board and we say, Eddie, what happened here? It looks like you were working on this for 4 weeks. What happened? And all of a sudden Eddie's like, why am I on the spot? What did I do wrong? And it becomes about each individual person rather than what can we fix as a team. And so let's take a look at outliers and how we can shift that conversation slightly. So we're going to look at a cycle time scatter plot, and we're going to review how long work items are taking. Typically, from a Kanban perspective, we look at that 85% cycle time number because that's an appropriate threshold of risk. When we look at 50%, that's only covering half of our work. So we want to look at a number slightly higher than that, and that will vary based on your risk tolerance. We want to look at the percentage of variance between these bands, and I'll show you what I mean here in a second. And then I like to look at outliers high and low. I always tell the teams that starting to review your scatter plots at your retrospective usually uncovers just some poor ticket hygiene where you have tickets that get opened and closed just because you need to be able to attach code to it, or you have a bunch of things that were completed in like 0 days that just moved through the system for a record, or you have stuff that got opened and then just sat there and you kind of forgot about it because it never showed up on a board. So starting to dig into this data usually shows just some gaps in how you're taking care of how work moves through your system. The other thing I like to do in reviewing this kind of data is I ask somebody or multiple people to open up a calendar so that we can be having a conversation that looks at the data and the timeline and events of what the team was going through. So we might see some things on the scatter plot where we're like, why was Eddie's ticket in progress for 4 weeks? But then somebody else is going to pull up in calendar and be like, oh, that was right when we first got sent home for COVID lockdown, right? And so we all had to get set up with new workstations working from home, and that's why it took us a little bit longer to get through that work item. So it can be a really nice check to have somebody kind of looking through and saying, oh, no, we had an offsite, or somebody was sick and was out for 2 weeks, and helping kind of connect the dots between the data and the events for their team. So this is a screenshot from, this is in Jira, but this is Actionable Agile in Jira. These are the percentiles that I was mentioning. And the best way to think about the percentiles that show up on your cycle time scatter plot is if there are 100 tickets on this board, 85 of the tickets would be below your 85% line. So it's showing you of the total tickets, how many of them are above or below that line. So in this case, 85% of the tickets on this board were completed in 16 days or less, which you can see over here on the right. One of the things that I mentioned in terms of the differences between the bands is looking at 50%, 70%, 85 and 95. You can see it goes from 7 days up to 16 days. So half of the tickets are done in 7 days. 85% of the tickets are done in 16 days. So that's some of the information that you can gather just from looking at this quickly. And then you can click on these items and drill into them. And so I'd like to narrow my scope down to the last 2 weeks, which I'm not entirely sure how Jira's does it. I think it's a date range picker. For this one, you narrow in on the box here at the bottom. And as you go through and you focus on the last 2 weeks or since your last retrospective, what we want to ask is, what happened with some of these items here that were way above our 85% line? So like this one, I could click and stick it and then click on this and drill in to what happened with that ticket. Like I said, we want to make sure that we're talking about events and parts of our process or dependencies on other teams and not singling out a single person for their work. This is going to help us look at variability in our flow. So all those dots all over, the more outliers we have, the more swing we have in those percentiles, and what could be causing that variability. But this is a good opportunity to talk about where is work sitting and nothing's happening, right? So a lot of times when we start digging into those outliers, that's the case, like something's stuck and waiting for approval or waiting for deployment or waiting in some state where it can't move through until it moves into the next part of the process. So what changes could we make based on our scatter plot? We might revise workflow policies. And so a lot of times, I shouldn't say a lot of times. One of the things I see a lot of teams, especially transitioning from Scrum to Kanban, do is they get rid of any kind of grooming or pointing activity because you don't need story points in Kanban. And while that's true, you still need to talk to each other about the work that you're doing. And so one of the, what often happens is we drop the, everyone's like, we don't need that meeting anymore. We'll just pull work in and that's continuous flow. And then they pull tickets in and they're like, we don't know how the hell to do this. We don't know what it's asking for. We don't know, we haven't had any conversation about what the work is. And so oftentimes you'll see high cycle time on high outliers on those tickets where it's like we pulled a ticket in and then we had to spend the first 3 days working on this, trying to understand what the work was requesting or how we were going to deliver that item. So revising workflow policies can be an important step there. This could also result in different work item states, or workflow states. So you could say, we're going to add an analysis column before the to-do column or after the to-do column. That gives us an opportunity to vet things before we pull them into in progress. You can also look at how do you increase the priority of aging items? And we're going to come back to this one as our example. Jira puts little dots at the bottom of the cards. I was working with a client this morning that said they had had a team agreements meeting and they decided that they were going to institute a 2-dot rule, which if once anything moved past 2 dots on the Jira like aging dot indicator, that meant that they had to stop and take action on it. And then do you have an option here to pair to share knowledge or learn on some of these tickets and help each other? So I've in the past referred to this aging items problem as we can either stop, swarm, or split, and swarm being the opportunity to say if something hits a certain threshold in terms of age, that means that you need to pull somebody else in. It can be hard to ask for help, especially in stand-ups when you're on the spot and everyone's like, why is your ticket stuck? Why have you had the same status, at stand-up for the last 4 days? If you have some policies or team agreements around what to do there, I think that can be a helpful way to make sure that you take action. So let's talk through outliers and how you could apply cause, change, check, and correct to your outliers. So I mentioned aging work. A lot of times I see teams make an action item that is make aging work visible. And we just talked about that with the Jira dots. I think that that's a noble cause, but kind of misses the whole point of making it visible, right? So how do we drive action when work hits a certain threshold? So the need in this case might be if our work item ages over 4 days, we will swarm or split the ticket, right? Or we will stop, basically all hands on deck to get it over the finish line. That could be the change that we're gonna test. And then our measure could be over the next 2 weeks, we expect that we won't see any ticket go older than 6 days if we're doing this correctly. And so what you might be able to do then is come back to your retro and say, we created an action plan around what happens when tickets age over a certain threshold, and we followed through on that, or we didn't, right? And I think that's also a viable outcome here, is that we come back together and we say, it looks like we still have a bunch of items on our scatter plot that look like they ended up being, 10 or 12 days, clearly over the change we wanted to test. So it doesn't seem like we took the action that we had planned on or the action we required. So how do we adjust the fix in this case to try to make sure that we're driving towards some action? All right, let's talk blockers. So blockers are basically anything that's going to prevent us from getting work done. I've found, regardless of method or framework that the teams are using, one of the things that often happens is that teams are really great at showing that their work is blocked and then often not telling the team that's blocking them. So it's like, we'll sit and wait for 3 weeks because we're getting blocked by an SRE team, but the SRE team has no idea that they're blocking us. So I always like trying to talk about blockers. There's a couple different ways you can do this. I think blocker clustering, or looking at internal versus external blockers, is great. I'm going to show you a tool that does this, but I actually think the best way to do any kind of blocker evaluation is like a whiteboard. Like, get them on stickies, talk about the blockers that you had over the course of your 2-week period, and break them out into things like internal versus external, or what is the root cause of each of these blockers, and make some groups so you can really see them. Miro in times of COVID is a great substitute for being able to whiteboard this, where you can have everybody add all the blockers that they ran into and start to group them. Miro, I guess, at least forces us to do some silent grouping that doesn't always happen in a room. This is from a tool called Swift Kanban, where you can sort out the different types of blockers that you have. And this is showing you for each type of blocker, which you can see all the types there in the legend, how many cards were blocked and how much time was lost to blocking. I think that this is pretty tricky to do without a tool that's really built for it. Jira doesn't handle this super well. I've run into problems trying to add a lot of different blocker flags, and they don't know that they've got a good, at least not that I've seen a good report for that. And that's where I think trying to get the team really involved in identifying what the types of blockers are is a good first step to being able to do something about it. You can see a fair amount here: task switching, on hold, team member on leave, external dependency. This might even be overkill for the first time you do this. Maybe you just start with something as simple as blocked by us. I've done blocked by us, blocked by the org, blocked by outside the org. So those 3 are kind of a nice starting point for that conversation. So what is this going to tell us? It's going to show us, first of all, where work is getting blocked. So in our system, where are we getting stuck? What are the most frequent types of blockers that are affecting your team? Like I mentioned at the beginning, do we need to escalate or increase visibility? And then the last one, like, is there some kind of risk here is this a risk that we can mitigate? Like sometimes moving further to the left, or thinking about how do we get the right people involved sooner so that we're not waiting to the end and getting blocked further down. So what kind of changes could we make? First of all, don't hide what's blocked. Don't work around it. Don't move it off your board. I think that's everybody's tendency, is like, I'm blocked, next. Keep it there, keep it visible. We could make sure that make sure that all of our work is in one place. Make external blockers visible to that group. We could also make decisions around revising our workflow policies, in the example of, sometimes things get blocked because by the time we go to take action on them, the steps prior weren't completely done. So let's apply this model here. And I want to pick this third one here. So make external blockers visible to that group. So if our cause is that we keep getting blocked by, let's say, I used SRE, we'll use that as an example. We keep getting blocked by, or like a platform team, we keep getting blocked by an external team. Maybe our fix to test is that anytime that we get blocked, we're going to put a ticket on their board for the blocker that goes to in progress right away. And that we think by making that ticket visible on their board as a blocker, that it will reduce the time that we're blocked by third-party teams by 2 days, or we'll cut it down by 50%. So that gives us something that's more than just, yes, did we make it visible, right? So we're going back to what is the thing we're going to try, and what is the expected result we think that this will have. So our cause is we're getting blocked by third-party teams, and it's impacting our work. Our fix to test is that the work is going to show up on their boards as soon as we mark it blocked. And then our measure is that we think this will decrease our block time by 50%. I'm just making up a number there. That would be ideal though, wouldn't it? Okay, unplanned work. So it's been kind of interesting over the last couple of years. I would say the pendulum has really swung in terms of the coaching that I've been doing, and I've moved almost entirely to security teams, not on purpose. It's just kind of happened that way. Maybe it's word of mouth. It's a small community, perhaps. But in working with these security orgs, unplanned work is an interesting one because almost everything is unplanned work. One of the things we want to think about when we think about unplanned work is what impact does it have on the planned work? And is that impact acceptable, really? A lot of times, one of the first things we look at is response times to unplanned work. So if something I didn't plan on jumps into my to-do column, how long does it sit there before I pick it up? And is that response time acceptable? And then what impact does it have? So what am I stopping to pull that unplanned item in? There's probably a whole rant we could go down here in terms of the expedite lane to expedite or not to expedite. But one of the things you always have to consider is if the team has a high volume of interrupt work, if they're stopping something else to pick that up, something's getting paused and it's going to get older, right? So how do we look at that trade-off and try to quantify the impact of that unplanned work? This is from Focused Objectives. So this is a chart that's showing you the frequency of planned versus unplanned work by count on your vertical axis and by the cycle time on your horizontal axis. I think this one's kind of an interesting way to think about it because it's saying you can what you can see here is the relationship between volume and duration, right? So the more planned work or the more unplanned work, the planned, let's see if I can spit this out in one sentence. The more unplanned work goes up, the more both planned work moves to the right in terms of cycle time. So you start to see that where there's no unplanned work, where there's or way less from like 6 days over, your cycle time is faster. So this is kind of showing the relationship between the volume of unplanned work on the cycle time data. So what could you do? What is it? What is something what is this telling us and what could we try to change? So first, we might want to look at throttling the first point of our board or our first bounded column on our board. It might be telling us that we're just exceeding our capacity, like too much work is coming in. I always use the airport as an example here. So if you've ever thought about, or if you've ever flown somewhere and you get there and you land and they're like, okay, well, we're going to sit on the runway for 2 hours because there's no gate available, right? You have more planes coming into the airport than you have departing. And so when we think about arrivals and departures into our team, think of your team as that airport. Each person on your team is that gate. If you have more work coming in than work is leaving, you're exceeding the capacity of your team airport. One of the other things you want to look at for unplanned work is there enough slack in the system to respond to it? So can we pull work in without always having to stop something else? Do we have space there to do that? What impact is this having on how long people have to wait for things, right? So if we're always shifting gears, kind of back to that last view, if we always have to pause something planned to pull in something unplanned, what's that doing for how long it takes us to deliver both? So what changes could you make based on this? We could look at lowering the WIP limit on the to-do column, right? So that we're throttling the rate of arrivals into our system. You could create an allocation or capacity for planned versus unplanned work. I do this a lot for teams where I'll say, like, your to-do column should have a max of 4 and a minimum of 2. So there's always 2 things there, but there's always pretty much 2 vacant slots for the unplanned work to move into. It's kind of we were joking before of deferring commitment, right? Deferring commitment to the last responsible moment. If you leave some vacancies in your to-do column, you've always got room for unplanned work. So you're not always pushing planned work down. You can also look at the difference between lead time and cycle time. So if your cycle time may be very quick, but if your lead time is very long, then stuff is aging in your to-do column. So how do you look at how to reduce the amount of time that things are sitting there waiting to get picked up? Because in a lot of cases, even in the one I used with a minimum of 2 and a maximum of 4, you may always have unplanned work moving to the top of your queue. So those 2 things that are planned at the bottom can sit there for a very long time. So it's kind of a balance of looking at those numbers along with your work item ages. All right, so what changes could we make based on this? Oh, we just did that one. Okay, so let's talk about unplanned work. So the need in this case, or our cause that we're trying to address, could be that, let's say we're not getting any time to address planned work, planned projects, because everything is coming to the team that's high urgency. And we think our fix to try to test out, or our change that we're going to make as a team, is to create a expedite lane, let's say, with only one unplanned, or like an unplanned item can only go into one queue at a time. So we can only have one unplanned item at a time, and that we're going to reduce our overall system WIP to allow for that. And to check this, we could measure this fix by looking at cycle time for planned items versus unplanned items separately. And if the cycle time for planned items goes up when there's an unplanned item, then we know that we need to adjust our WIP limits, basically. So that is an example of how we could apply this to unplanned work. All right, the last one is all the feels. So let's talk about people. They're always the hardest part. Process is easy. The people are the hard part. So let's talk about like what we actually think of when we think of a retrospective. I think using the prime directive is a great place to start. So acknowledging that we are all doing the best we can given the circumstances, especially right now. I mean, I know we're tiptoeing out of the last year of COVID hell, but I think acknowledging some of the stress that this has added is still a great place to kick off. I think it can be nice to start with appreciations or kudos. I worked with one organization where we built a kudos wall in the kitchen because a lot of teams were giving kudos to other teams in their retros, and we wanted to make those really visible to outside teams. So we started a kudos wall. Make sure everyone gets a chance to be heard. You know, I'm sure everybody can relate. I've had teams where they're really dominated, the retro is really dominated by the loudest voice or the most vocal developer, and somebody else sits back and doesn't talk. There's, I think, a lot of ways that you can make sure that everybody gets a chance to talk, whether it's through a digital tool or round robin, or giving everybody a chance to go to the whiteboard, however you're facilitating, but making space for each person. Listen for cues of exhaustion. I think this is an important one, and I think it comes up in very subtle ways, but it can be stress, right? Piles, so people feeling overloaded or overburdened, or like they're the ones having to try to play catch up to get things moving through the system. Those are important things to pick up on because they have a real negative effect on your team's ability to work together and to deliver. And always acknowledge others' emotions. So I've told this story a few times lately, and hopefully she doesn't get mad at me, but I have a great friend who became a Scrum Master about 3 years ago, and she was facilitating her first retro, and I got a text in the middle of the day that said, "Is it normal for developers to cry in retros?" I was like, well, it can't, I've seen it all. I've seen people cry. I've seen people storm out. I've seen people, I've seen, I don't know if you guys have ever tried a safety check. I had one team I worked with where we did a safety check, and 3 times in a row, the safety check failed. So we didn't have a retro at all. We just canceled the retro until we brought somebody else in to try to help facilitate some workshops to try to build back some trust for that team. But I think one of the most important things we can do when facilitating these is make space for all of that emotion, right? It's at the end of the day, people do this work. So I don't want to just I like looking at all this data, but it doesn't mean anything without people, right? And the people that are there to do it. This is actually an old view from ScatterSpoke. So this is our tool for having retros that allows team members to anonymously add feedback to a retro board, vote, and group, and reply only in GIFs if you so choose. I think I'm a big fan of anonymous feedback for retros. I think sometimes it can, teams can choose, is what I always say, if they want to put their names on it. But I like to give, when I do these retros, I like to give the board link out at the start of the sprint and turn on private feedback so you can't see other people's feedback, but that way you can be adding notes to the board over the course of the whole sprint. And then a day or two before the retro, I turn on all the feedback so everybody can group and vote. And then that way, when we get in the room, we have an hour to talk about stuff and identify really great action items. I think one of the things that happens a lot when we get everybody together and we say, we've got an hour and we're going to spend 15 minutes adding stickies, is everyone's like, I don't remember what I had for breakfast. I don't know what happened 2 weeks ago. So you end up having a board, I think, that doesn't, or you end up gathering feedback that's not always super productive or super relevant. So I like to try to get continuous feedback throughout the sprint. So some of the things that we're looking at when we start talking about team feedback is our pace unsustainable? Are parts of the team overburdened? Are our policies clear and agreed upon? Workflow policies are so interesting to me. It's one of the things where when I'm working with new teams and I set up a session to talk through workflow policies, everyone's like, we know what we're supposed to be doing. And then we spend 60 minutes arguing about branch merge strategy or how many code reviews have to take place before you can check something in. Policies are always a great place when there's tension, I think, in a team or feeling like there's mixed responsibilities or not clear responsibilities. I think workflow policies are a great place to start. Could we swarm on our work? And are we focused on delivering as a team? Fun story on that one. Well, let's talk about this in terms of what would we change. I worked with a team that was having a really hard time with basically, like, I would pull a ticket in and I owned that ticket to the end. I do not accept help. It's only my ticket. And so what we did for that team was we took off all the owners on the tickets. So there were no names on their JIRA board. So that when we did stand up, we actually had to listen to each other to hear what was happening and who was working on what and figure out where you could contribute. I thought that was a fun way to try to create more team ownership of all the work. But we can create policies to encourage swarming, like the one I just described, reduce WIP or add capacity, and make sure that you celebrate what gets done. So in this case, we could use that example I just used. The need or the cause for the change is that we feel like we're not really working together as a team to deliver. We're delivering in silos, or everybody's kind of got their own individual track. The fix we want to test out is if we took all the owners off the tickets, would it help us organize more around the work as a team? And how would we measure that? So it might mean that we have less work on the board than we have people on a team. Might be one way to measure that. And then how will we know that it's working, right? So will we see that we're working together on tickets or swarming on tickets as a team instead of delivering as an individual? Or will we tweak it? So I think what's the most important here is this combination, like I said, of feelings and data. I think we tend to think of our retros in terms of almost being all very, very feelings based, and we forget the data part. I think the data part becomes really important, like we said at the beginning, in understanding how we're working, and then using that as a baseline for our action items. And then folding in how the team is feeling about that data helps you figure out what are the most important things to work on next, or to drive out those improvements. There's always room for some kind of improvement. I think, even if you just come up with one really well-written experiment or action item, hypothesis from your retrospective, that's better than having 5 very binary action items of did we increase our WIP? Did we add this meeting? Did we add this policy? Leverage that data so that you're making really targeted improvements and that you have a way to measure that they're working. And then keep refining these. I think even, a nice model here is do this, identify this thing that you're working on that feels like a pain point for the team. And when you come back to look at the data to tell you if your change is working towards the, your desired result, if the answer is no, stick with that same action item, keep tweaking that and come up with a new refinement to work on that instead of creating a new list of action items. I think we have a tendency to do that too. It's like every retro must produce new action items. And in some cases that means we're ignoring or throwing away the ones that still need revision. And never skip your retro. All right, that is everything I have for you. I saw there was a lot going on in chat. So I'm going to stop sharing so you guys can come off mute and we can just ask questions in here.
Yeah, there was a ton of questions. Chat. Does somebody just want to take themselves off mute and ask a question?
Yeah, I was interested in, you touch on a few points across various topics in terms of not putting blame on the person and looking at the process and various things that were kind of similar across the board. And one of the fundamental things that I work on all the time is psychological safety. And I think is very tricky to get right. And that's kind of the starting point and everything. Otherwise, whatever people talk in retrospective is probably not the right things that you need to be talking about. And I was wondering what kind of tools or what kind of approaches have you taken and across all of these areas to increase psychological safety?
I do like doing the safety checks. I think they're good. I think you have to have a plan. So especially if you feel that angst for a team, like I was mentioning with the group I worked with, where we just did it was in person. So we just did them on Post-its and we said, is anybody not feel safe in this conversation, being honest and moving forward with the retro? And if we got one yes, we stopped, we didn't move forward with the retro. I didn't have a plan for what was going to happen if that kept happening. And by the 3rd time, I was like, oh shit, like I got to figure something out. I don't know what to do with this team. And there's clearly something going on that I can't fix. And so in that particular case, we did a really cool exercise that was kind of like the Myers-Briggs, like your 4-letter communication code, where somebody came in, every person on the team took that test, and somebody came in and modeled out the different communication styles of everyone on the team. And I loved it because it helped see, like, I like direct communication, but maybe somebody else on the team was more informing and needed to work through things more with more background. And it helped everybody kind of see where we were all starting from. I think activities like that can go a long way, especially when there's a lot of friction and people just shut down. And then I mentioned the other thing, I like gathering data in advance, especially as we all start to go back to the office. I think it's even more important because not everyone feels comfortable going to the wall to, put up a sticky and say, it really sucked when we had that outage and I had to get up at midnight and no one was there to help me. because that feels like I'm blaming everybody else, right? I'm blaming everybody else for not helping me with the thing, whatever. So I think sometimes, figuring out how to gather that data in advance. But I will say, I think that presents some interesting challenges for us as facilitators. You have to be careful when you're facilitating the retro, not to be like, this says that we had, an outage at midnight and no one was there to help. Who wrote this? Or like, does anybody want to add color to this? So I find if I do that, where I collect the data in advance, I really have to go through it in advance and prep myself for the conversation, like getting to the root cause without being like, who said this? Who was up at midnight? So those are some things I think that can help, though.
Thanks.
And what other questions were there? Maro, you had a few questions. Do you want to ask one of them?
I've been trying to dig them for the last 3 minutes and I couldn't. It completely went under. Give me a couple more minutes. I'm scanning through the chat.
Oh, I saw somebody say they don't like Myers-Briggs. That's fair. I've definitely seen it weaponized in a not so healthy way, but there's some applications that are useful.
I mean, you can say that of pretty much everything. I mean, everything can be dangerous. Yeah. Really, even marmalade can kill you. I mean, and nothing is exact. I mean, unless you don't even know if we exist in this world. I mean, if we put everything to the extreme, it's useful if you use it right. And right means different things to different teams. And latest, when people try to kill each other in the team, you know that you did it wrong. So. It's,
yeah, I think as you said, depending how you use it, I think you can be very specific and go through all the Myers-Briggs and try to overanalyze things and try to find things. But I think even if you go at a very high level and you try to come up with a common understanding of how introverts and extroverts communicate and do things, and again, coming from a very extremely introvert person, you arm yourself with a lot of artifacts that you use to drive conversation, and you sometimes usually start with a joke and everything, and talking through all of these things make people understand where you're coming from. And again, the whole Myers-Briggs end result, whether you are ENTJ or INTJ or anything, it stop being relevant. It's more relevant who you are and why you do the things you do. And I think that's the point we want to take the conversation to.
Yeah, basic understanding of each other, right? Empathy, empathy maps. I've done empathy maps in retros too, especially. I don't know if this is a common pattern for any of you. There can be some friction at times, I think, between product and engineering teams. And I've done empathy maps where I've had the developers make an empathy map for the product owner and vice versa, but with everybody in the room. So it's like, what's the product owner seeing and thinking and hearing and feeling from the developer's perspective, and then give the product owner a chance to acknowledge it and recognize what fits and maybe what's missing from it, and vice versa. I think a lot of those come down to like what you were asking about with trust and safety. It's understanding where other people are coming from too.
Yeah, I think all these exercises, I'm talking about psychological safety and all these things. For me, it's kind of the starting point, and then you move on to setting up your working agreements, and then you understand how people work and what their preferences are and all the rest. Yep. And I think the interesting thing, and why I feel is relevant, and I feel it makes sense for people to do that, is if everything ultimately, if everything was BS, you will end up with the same perfect solution for every team in every single scenario. But when you go to different teams and you end up with different maps, and you end up with radically different working agreements and way of communicating and things, then you can clearly see that, oh, this is working. This team works in a particular way and the other team works in a different way. And then you work with different challenges. Is how do you work across teams, because they don't actually match each other.
Yeah. Yeah, that team that I had done that with, one of the things that was really interesting from a coaching perspective was there were the 4 quadrants, and everyone on the team was in the same quadrant, which was not driving, like struggle driving things to completion, like to think about things but had a hard time executing. And that team, it was a scrum team, and they would every sprint commit to like 50, 60 points and deliver like less than 20. And every time I was like, I feel like, you know, if we look at past data, it's telling us that's too much work. But it was interesting when we saw that of like, okay, well, we've got all the same personality types here, where that's really how they think, right? They like the challenge of analysis, but maybe less on the execution side. So how do we account for that and how we're working together? David, you posted an interesting one in here on wicked questions. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, like wicked questions would be when you're asking too paradoxical, you're recognizing that issues to be resolved in each of the scenarios that you described relating to each of the metrics could involve answering questions that seemingly contradict each other. Like, you have children, well, so this might be one you could relate to. How can I raise kids that are autonomous but also have a tight family? Right? Yeah. Independence versus cooperation. But going at abstract issues and getting the group to flesh out what they think the questions are that are fundamentally oppositional, and then looking for the common ground in the middle. Those exercises in liberating structures are really quick. They're short. So if you said, you know, we got some work products out of this retrospective, and now instead of just listing 20 actions, let's go after something a little bigger than that and see if we can capture some of the paradoxes and look at the actual method of defining what we're working at. The WINFI thing is more about what I need from you. That's more about articulating a good question. And that might work better when you're being blocked by another team, so that you could say something like, what I need from the other team is, and you ask a question. And in the protocol, the question has to have the answer, yes, no, or I don't know what you're talking about. So you have to learn to ask productive questions, and a productive or a good question as opposed to an ugly question is one that you know the other person has the power to deliver the answer to, and one that's clear enough for someone to actually deliver something. And frequently when there's a recurring blocking pattern, that kind of interaction could be really useful because it lets both people cut to the chase, you know.
That's interesting. I like that. That seems super productive for some of the stuff we're talking about too, and getting everybody to the table and giving everybody a chance to bring what's important to them, right? Creating space.
And I think it keeps the retrospective fresh to, I mean, my retrospective, I'm in education, my retrospectives are a lot more like, I'm not that as specific. And the data that I'm using, I'm getting from previous meeting retrospectives. So I'm like, you know, there's a number of comments of frustration similar to what it was before, but I'm generally asking the questions, what's working well, what's not working well, and needs to be replaced or reinvented, and what are we relying on? What can we not touch? You know, because if we touch it, it'll screw things up. So yeah. my retrospectives are maybe a little bit different than I still think I try to use data in every retrospective because my whole goal is to get people to make evidence-based decisions. And in education, that's, how do you know you're teaching kids well? I put my finger in there, I've been teaching for 30 years. You just know. You know, but if you just know and she just knows and you don't agree, then what? So you need to have using the data is really crucial. And so I like the approach that you're using. It's just that idea of having, what are we trying to do, and keep coming back to that and make sure that the metrics don't become the only God. Like we've got metrics in Agile that we rely on, or in Lean also, but not to make that like the only thing we're thinking about.
Yeah, and along the same lines of that, I saw Tristan had a comment in here about like, how do we affect change in 2 weeks? And I think that that's a good, like when you're thinking about how you measure these things, I think in some cases it's 100% okay to say, this is going to take us 2 months, or this is going to take us, just like we would for a feature metric or a feature outcome, right? We don't expect to deploy something and get metrics back immediately. We say like in the first 3 months, we hope to see this type of activation or acquisition or whatever the metric is that we're trying to track around adoption or usage. you know, same thing with your retro experiments here. I think it's fully acceptable to say, we're going to check back in on this in 2 months or after the release and see how it's impacted things. The smaller, the better, just like everything else we do. I mean, I think if you can have some steps that ladder up to that, to know if it's working, it gives you more opportunity to refine it than waiting for 3 months to know if it's working or not working. But I think some of these things aren't micro changes, right? It's like, what is the improvement we're trying to make, and how do we start to work towards that? And, it can be check back and change something, and check back and change something.
All right, we should probably start wrapping up. Kind of getting late in the evening here, so thanks very much, Colleen.
Yeah,
really interesting. So I'll put the recording onto the meetup page, and we'll put it on the YouTube channel. And Colleen, I don't know whether you can send me your slides and we can share those with the group as well.
Yeah, definitely. I'll send them over when we're done. Thanks everybody for joining. I know there was a football match tonight, so I appreciate
it. Finished just before we started. Not that we timed it that way, but yeah, we were lucky.
Perfect.
All right.
Well, thanks y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.